As the day quietly fades and stars begin to whisper above, welcome to Korean History Whispers. Tonight, we gently explore the heart and mind of Yi Sun-sin, the admiral whose brilliant mind and unshakable resolve saved a nation from destruction. While his victories stand immortal in history, tonight you will feel the pulse of the man behind the legend. Close your eyes and let his whispered memories carry you to peaceful sleep. The year was 1545, and Korea found itself caught between the rising ambitions of neighboring powers and the internal struggles of a kingdom, trying to find its place in a rapidly changing world. In this age of uncertainty, when scholarly pursuits dominated the royal court and military affairs seemed almost secondary, a child was born who would prove that sometimes the fate of nations rests not in the hands of diplomats, but in the courage of warriors willing to sacrifice everything for their homeland. Yi Sun-sin entered the world in a family that had once known greatness, but now lived in the shadow of political catastrophe. The Yi clan of Deoksu could trace their lineage to illustrious ancestors, who had served the kingdom with distinction. But those golden days had ended abruptly during the purge known as the Gemio Literati Purge. His grandfather, Yi Baek-rok, had been caught in the political whirlwind that swept away so many promising lives, leaving the family's fortunes in ruins, and their future uncertain. Imagine the weight that settled upon young shoulders in such a household. Yi Sun-sin's father, Yi Jing, had deliberately turned away from government service, choosing instead the quiet dignity of a private life, rather than risk the family's remaining members to the capricious winds of court politics. Yet even in their reduced circumstances, the family maintained the rigid moral standards and educational expectations that had defined their ancestors. This was a home where character mattered more than wealth, where duty trumped comfort, and where the next generation was expected to restore what previous generations had lost. The boy's mother played a crucial role in shaping the man he would become. She possessed that rare combination of fierce love and unwavering discipline that produces exceptional children. Under her watchful eye, Yi Sun-sin learned not just the classical texts that every educated Korean was expected to master, but more importantly, the moral principles that would guide him through the darkest moments of his life. She taught him to stand with the weak against the strong, to choose justice over expedience, and to never compromise his principles for personal advantage. These early lessons would prove invaluable, but they also marked him as different from his contemporaries. While other young men learned the art of political accommodation, Yi Sun-sin absorbed the conviction that some things were worth fighting for regardless of the personal cost. While others mastered the subtle negotiations required for advancement in a bureaucratic system, he developed the direct, uncompromising approach that would later make him both beloved by his subordinates and distrusted by his superiors. The first great test of his character came not in battle, but in the pursuit of his chosen career. In 1572, Yi Sun-sin presented himself at the military academy for the special examination that would determine whether he possessed the skills necessary to serve as an officer in the Royal Army. He had prepared for this moment with the same meticulous attention to detail that would later characterize his naval campaigns. His swordsmanship was excellent, his archery accurate, his knowledge of military classics comprehensive, but fate, that cruel teacher, had prepared a different lesson. During the mounted combat portion of the examination, Yi Sun-sin's horse stumbled and threw him to the ground with bone-jarring force. The injury was severe enough to disqualify him from the competition, but the psychological blow was far worse. Here was a young man who had invested everything in this single opportunity, only to see it snatched away by pure chance. Lesser men might have accepted this setback as a sign that military service was not their destiny. They might have turned to other pursuits, perhaps following their father's example by avoiding the risks and disappointments that came with serving the kingdom. Yi Sun-sin made a different choice. He treated the failure not as an endpoint, but as a temporary obstacle to be overcome through renewed effort and unwavering determination. 4 years later, in 1576, he returned to take the examination again. This time, there were no accidents, no unexpected reversals of fortune. His performance was so exceptional that it eliminated any doubt about his qualifications for military service. The appointment that followed sent him to the northern frontier regions, where the kingdom's borders faced constant pressure from various tribal groups, and where young officers could gain the practical experience that no classroom could provide. The northern frontier was Korea's equivalent of the American Wild West, a place where survival depended more on quick reflexes and sound judgment than on political connections or scholarly achievements. Here, Yi Sun-sin encountered his first taste of the life and death decisions that would define his career. The local commanders were hard men who had earned their positions through demonstrated competence rather than family influence, and they had little patience for inexperienced officers who might endanger their troops through inexperience or cowardice. It was in this unforgiving environment that Yi Sun-sin faced his second major crisis, one that would teach him harsh lessons about the gap between military necessity and political expectations. The incident occurred at Nakdondo Island, a strategic position that controlled access to important river routes. Yi Sun-sin had been assigned to defend this outpost with a small garrison. But intelligence reports indicated that a massive enemy force was approaching, far larger than his men could hope to resist successfully. The young officer faced an impossible choice. He could follow the heroic tradition that demanded stand defenses regardless of the odds, fighting to the death and perhaps taking some enemies with him. Or he could make the coldly practical decision to withdraw his forces to defensible positions where they might live to fight another day. Yi Sun-sin chose preservation over empty heroics, leading his men to safety before the overwhelming enemy force could trap and annihilate them. From a purely military standpoint, his decision was unquestionably correct. He had preserved valuable trained soldiers and equipment that would have been lost in a futile gesture. But from the perspective of court officials who measured military virtue by willingness to die gloriously, his withdrawal looked like cowardice. The political consequences were swift and devastating: demotion, disgrace, and assignment to serve as a common soldier despite his officer training. His punishment, known as white-robed service, was designed to be both humiliating and educational. Stripped of rank and authority, Yi Sun-sin found himself performing the menial tasks assigned to the lowest members of the military hierarchy. He hauled supplies, dug fortifications, and took orders from men who might have been serving under him if circumstances had been different. For someone of his background and education, the experience was profoundly humbling. Yet rather than breaking his spirit, this period of disgrace became another formative experience that would shape his later greatness. Serving alongside common soldiers gave him insights into their concerns, capabilities, and motivations that few officers ever acquired. He learned to see military operations from the bottom up rather than the top down, understanding how strategic decisions affected the men who would be asked to implement them. Most importantly, he discovered that true leadership had nothing to do with rank or titles, and everything to do with earning the trust and respect of those under his command. When his punishment period ended, Yi Sun-sin returned to regular military service with a broader perspective on both warfare and human nature. His next assignments took him through various administrative and military positions that provided him with a comprehensive understanding of how the kingdom's defense systems actually functioned. He served as a county magistrate in Jeonjep, where he learned the civilian side of government administration. He commanded border fortresses where he gained additional experience in defensive operations and troop management. Each position taught him something new about the complex relationship between military effectiveness and political reality. As a magistrate, he saw firsthand how military campaigns affected civilian populations, and how local resources could be mobilized to support defensive efforts. As a fortress commander, he learned the importance of logistics, intelligence gathering, and maintaining morale during long periods of routine duty, punctuated by moments of intense danger. Throughout this period, Yi Sun-sin was building a reputation among those who served with him. His subordinates learned that he never asked them to take risks he wouldn't take himself, never wasted their lives on pointless gestures, and never forgot that their welfare was his responsibility. His superiors discovered that he could be trusted to carry out difficult assignments without constant supervision, and that his unconventional methods often produced better results than traditional approaches. The recognition of his abilities reached the highest levels of government through the recommendations of influential officials who had observed Yi Sun-sin and Yu Hong were among those who brought his name to the attention of the royal court, while Yu Seong's wrote wrong, one of the most respected ministers of the era, added his own endorsement. These recommendations carried particular weight because they came from men known for their careful judgment and reluctance to advance unqualified candidates. The appointment that resulted from these endorsements would prove to be one of the most consequential decisions in Korean history. In 1591, just 1 year before the Japanese invasion that would threaten the kingdom's very existence, Yi Sun-sin was named naval commander of Jeolla Left Province. The promotion was extraordinary in its scope. He was elevated several ranks beyond what his seniority would normally justify, a clear indication that the government recognized exceptional circumstances required exceptional measures. The appointment was not without controversy. Court officials who had expected more gradual advancement through traditional channels questioned whether such rapid promotion was wise or fair. Some wondered whether Yi Sun-sin's unconventional background and previous disgrace made him unsuitable for such a critical position. Others worried that his reputation for inflexibility might make him difficult to work with in the complex political environment that surrounded high military commands. Yi Sun-sin himself understood the significance of what was being entrusted to him. The naval forces of Jeolla province controlled sea routes that were vital to the kingdom's commerce and defense. In the event of a major conflict, these waters would become a crucial battleground where Korea's fate might well be decided. The responsibility was enormous, the expectations almost impossibly high, and the margin for error virtually non-existent. From his first day in command, Yi Sun-sin approached his new duties with the same methodical thoroughness that had characterized his entire career. He inspected every ship under his command, evaluated every officer, and assessed the combat readiness of every sailor. What he found was deeply troubling: a naval force that had grown complacent during years of relative peace, with equipment in poor condition, training standards that had slipped, and a general attitude that suggested serious warfare was unlikely. The transformation he initiated was both comprehensive and intensive. Ships were overhauled or replaced entirely. Weapons were upgraded and properly maintained. Training exercises became more frequent and more realistic. Most importantly, the entire organizational culture was shifted from peacetime routine to wartime readiness. This was not popular among officers and sailors who had grown comfortable with easier duties. But Yi Sun-sin understood that popularity was a luxury he could not afford. His most significant innovation during this period was the development and deployment of the turtle ship, a revolutionary warship design that would become legendary in naval history. These vessels combined the firepower of traditional warships with armor protection that made them nearly invulnerable to conventional attacks. The turtle ships were not just technological marvels, but psychological weapons that would strike terror into enemy fleets unprepared for such formidable opponents. The design process revealed Yi Sun-sin's genius for combining theoretical knowledge with practical innovation. He understood the limitations of existing ship designs and the tactical advantages that superior protection and firepower could provide. But he also grasped the importance of maintaining the element of surprise. The turtle ships were kept secret until the moment they would be needed most. ensuring maximum impact when they finally appeared in battle. Training his crews in the use of these new weapons required additional time and effort that many questioned. Why spend precious resources on experimental designs when traditional ships had served adequately for generations? Yi Sun-sin's answer was simple but profound. The coming conflict would not be fought according to traditional rules, and victory would belong to those who adapted most quickly to new realities. His prescience became apparent as intelligence reports throughout 1591 and early 1592 painted an increasingly ominous picture of Japanese preparations for a massive invasion. While other Korean officials dismissed these reports as exaggerated or interpreted them as mere saber-rattling designed to extract diplomatic concessions, Yi Sun-sin took them with deadly seriousness. Every piece of information was analyzed, every implication considered, every possible contingency planned for. The level of preparation he demanded was extraordinary even by the standards of his era. On the day before the Japanese invasion actually began, Yi Sun-sin was still conducting weapons training exercises aboard his turtle ships, drilling his crews in the use of various types of artillery and ensuring that every man knew his role in the complex choreography of naval combat. This was not paranoia, but the careful attention to detail that separates great commanders from merely competent ones. As spring arrived in 1592, the signs of approaching catastrophe became unmistakable. Japanese ships were massing in unprecedented numbers. Diplomatic communications had become increasingly hostile. Intelligence networks reported massive military preparations that could only be intended for major offensive operations. Korea stood on the brink of the greatest crisis in its history, and few of its leaders truly comprehended the magnitude of what was approaching. Yi Sun-sin was one of the few who understood. In his headquarters at the Jeolla Left Naval Base, he made final preparations for a conflict that would test every lesson he had learned throughout his career. The boy who had been thrown from his horse during a military examination had become the man upon whom his nation's survival might depend. The young officer who had been disgraced for choosing practical wisdom over heroic gestures had evolved into the commander who would need to make life and death decisions for thousands of sailors and millions of civilians. The irony was not lost on him. The very qualities that had brought him disgrace and delayed his advancement were precisely the quality his willingness to think independently, to challenge conventional wisdom, to prioritize results over appearances, and to accept personal responsibility for difficult decisions, would prove invaluable. When traditional approaches failed and desperate innovation became the only path to survival. But even as he completed his preparations, Yi Sun-sin could not have imagined the full scope of what lay ahead. The battles he would fight would become legendary not just in Korea but throughout the world. The strategies he would devise would be studied by military theorists for centuries. The sacrifices he would make would inspire generations of patriots facing seemingly impossible odds. The stage was set for one of history's most remarkable displays of military genius and personnel courage. A kingdom unprepared for war was about to face an enemy that had been planning its conquest for years. Professional soldiers who had never faced serious combat were about to confront veterans hardened by decades of civil war. Traditional naval tactics were about to meet revolutionary innovations that would change maritime warfare forever. At the center of this approaching storm stood Yi Sun-sin, no longer the young man who had stumbled at his first examination, but not yet the legendary admiral whose name would echo through the ages. He was simply a naval commander who had done his duty to the best of his ability, and now waited to see whether his preparations would prove adequate for the trials ahead. The wait would not be long. Across the waters that separated Korea from Japan, invasion fleets were already setting sail, carrying with them the ambitions of warlords who dreamed of continental conquest, and the weapons of soldiers who had never known defeat. The collision between these forces and the determination of one Korean admiral would reshape the destiny of East Asia, and create legends that would never be forgotten. The message arrived like a thunderbolt from hell itself. On the 15th of April, 1592, at the hour of the rooster, a breathless messenger stumbled into Yi Sun-sin's headquarters, bearing news that would change the course of history. Admiral Yi urgent dispatch carried just a few lines, but those words contained the seeds of national catastrophe. Countless Japanese warships invaded Bisun on the 13th day of the 4th month. At the hour of the monkey, the invasion had begun with devastating swiftness. Bisun, Korea's southeastern gateway, had fallen in mere hours. The Gyeongsang-left naval forces under Park Hung had already been destroyed. Their ships scattered or sunk, their crews dead or fled. What Korean military planners had discussed as a distant possibility had become an immediate, overwhelming reality. While panic spread through the royal court and confusion paralyzed military commanders across the kingdom, Yi Sun-sin responded with the cold calculation that would define his legend. He had prepared for this moment with obsessive thoroughness. And now that preparation would be tested against an enemy that had spent decades perfecting the art of warfare through constant civil conflict. Rather than rushing immediately into battle, Yi Sun-sin chose a different path. He would watch Claude learn, and strike when the conditions favored victory rather than heroic defeat. This decision required enormous self-discipline. Every instinct demanded immediate action to relieve the beleaguered defenders. But strategic wisdom counseled patience until he could fight on his own terms. On May 4, that patience was finally rewarded. Yi Sun-sin led his fleet out from the Gyeolla-left naval base, in what would be remembered as the first sortie of a campaign that would reshape naval warfare forever. His destination was Hansan Island, where he would rendezvous with Admiral Yi-sun's surviving forces, and begin the counterattack that would save Korea from total conquest. The sight of Yi Sun-sin's fleet must have been both magnificent and terrifying. At its heart sailed the revolutionary turtle ships, their armored hulls bristling with cannon, and their crews trained to a pitch of readiness that few naval forces in the world could match. Surrounding them were traditional Panaxion warships, their crews eager to prove their worth against an enemy that had already humiliated Korean arms on land. May 7 brought the first test of arms at Okpo, where the opening notes of Yi Sun-sin's Symphony of Destruction would be played. The Japanese fleet had anchored in Okpo Bay, confident in their numerical superiority, and secure in the knowledge that Korean naval forces had shown little fight in previous encounters. They were about to discover how wrong such assumptions could be. The Japanese ships were caught in the worst possible position, anchored close to shore with their crews engaged in plundering coastal villages, rather than maintaining battle readiness. When Yi Sun-sin's fleet appeared on the horizon, the enemy commanders faced a terrible choice. Fight from a disadvantageous position or attempt to escape while under attack. 6 Japanese vessels chose to fight, their crews scrambling to battle stations as Korean ships bore down upon them with deadly precision. The engagement that followed was brief but devastating. Korean artillery, fired with accuracy born of intensive training, shattered Japanese hulls and rigging. The turtle ships, making their combat debut, proved virtually invulnerable to enemy counterattacks, while dealing out destruction with methodical efficiency. When the smoke cleared, 21 Japanese ships had been destroyed, 13 large vessels, 6 medium warships, and 2 smaller craft. Not a single Korean ship had been lost, and casualties were minimal. It was a victory so complete that even Yi Sun-sin's own officers could barely believe what they had accomplished, but this was only the beginning. Yi Sun-sin understood that one victory, however spectacular, would not be enough to alter the strategic balance. The Japanese invasion force was enormous, their supply lines stretched across hundreds of miles of ocean, and their commitment to conquest absolute. Only a sustained campaign of destruction would force them to reconsider their ambitions. The fleet moved on to Happo and Gyeokjinpo, where additional Japanese squadrons met the same fate as their comrades at Okpo. Each engagement followed a similar pattern. Korean forces would appear suddenly, strike with overwhelming firepower, and disappear before enemy reinforcements could arrive. It was a style of warfare perfectly suited to Yi Sun-sin's strengths and his enemy's weaknesses. Reports of these victories sent shockwaves through both Korean and Japanese command structures. For the Koreans, Yi Sun-sin's success provided the first good news since the invasion began. Proof that Japanese forces could be defeated by superior tactics and preparation. For the Japanese, the naval defeats represented a serious threat to their entire campaign strategy, which depended on secure sea lanes for supplies and reinforcements. The second sortie began with intelligence that Japanese ships had concentrated at Sakyeon, apparently preparing for major operations against Korean coastal positions. Yi Sun-sin saw an opportunity to strike another devastating blow before the enemy could disperse or strengthen their defenses. The approach to Sakyeon revealed both the possibilities and the dangers of the tactical situation. Japanese ships were indeed present in significant numbers, but they had anchored close to shore where land-based artillery could support them. Moreover, the tidal conditions would limit Korean maneuverability and make withdrawal difficult if the battle went badly. It was here that the turtle ship proved its revolutionary worth. These armored vessels could advance into positions where traditional warships would be destroyed by concentrated enemy fire, delivering point-blank attacks that could shatter enemy formations. As the tide turned in Korea's favor, literally and figuratively, Yi Sun-sin's turtle ship spearheaded an assault that destroyed the entire Japanese squadron. The victory came at a cost. Yi Sun-sin himself was wounded when an enemy bullet struck his left shoulder, and his subordinate Myeongnyang suffered more serious injuries. But the strategic impact was immense. The Japanese had learned that Korean waters were no longer safe for their operations, and their confidence in easy naval superiority had been shattered beyond repair. June brought the third sortie and an even bolder objective, an attack on Dangpo, where Japanese forces had established what they believed to be a secure anchorage. Yi Sun-sin's appearance there sent another clear message: nowhere along Korea's coast would be safe from his reach. The battle at Dangpo followed the now familiar pattern of Korean tactical superiority, producing devastating results. Admiral Yi Sun-sin's right naval forces joined the assault, demonstrating the growing coordination between different Korean naval commands. When the fighting ended, another Japanese squadron had been eliminated and Korean control of the seas further consolidated. The cumulative effect of these victories was beginning to reshape the entire strategic situation. Japanese commanders, who had initially dismissed Korean naval capabilities as negligible, now found themselves forced to divert significant resources to protecting their supply lines. Ships that should have been supporting land operations were instead engaged in defensive convoy duties, or searching for the elusive Korean admiral, who had become their nemesis. Recognition of Yi Sun-sin's achievements came from the highest levels of government. King Seongjong elevated his rank to deputy minister, and promoted Yu Yakji to minister. Formal acknowledgement that these naval victories were among the few bright spots in an otherwise disastrous military situation. More importantly, the successes had bought precious time for Korean land forces to regroup and foreign allies to consider intervention. But Toyotomi Hideyoshi, the architect of the invasion, was not a man to accept defeat easily. Reports of the naval disasters reached his headquarters with disturbing frequency, each one representing not just tactical defeats, but strategic threats to his entire continental conquest plan. His response was characteristically decisive. If Korean naval forces could not be avoided, they would have to be destroyed through overwhelming force. The Japanese naval reorganization that followed was massive in scope and impressive in its thoroughness. Wokuze Kayasu Haru, a veteran of countless naval engagements, was withdrawn from land operations and given command of a fleet specifically designed to hunt down and destroy Yi Sun-sin's forces. Supporting him were other experienced naval commanders like Kuki Yoshitaka and Kato Yoshiaki. Men whose reputations had been built through decades of warfare, the force they assembled was formidable by any standard. 73 large warships, dozens of medium vessels, and numerous smaller craft, all manned by crews who had learned their trade in the savage naval battles of Japan's civil wars. This was not the kind of improvised fleet that had suffered defeats at Okpo and Sakyeon, but a professional force commanded by experts who understood both the importance of their mission and the capabilities of their opponent. When intelligence reports reached Yi Sun-sin describing the approaching enemy armada, he faced the greatest challenge of his career. The Japanese fleet outnumbered his forces by a significant margin, and was commanded by officers whose competence he could not question. Moreover, they would be fighting in Korean waters where they could choose the time and place of engagement to their best advantage. The strategic situation was further complicated by the location where this climactic battle would take place. The Japanese fleet had anchored at Myeongnyang, a narrow strait that would prevent Yi Sun-sin from deploying his forces in the extended formations that had proved so effective in earlier engagements. Fighting in such confined waters would neutralize many of his tactical advantages, while playing to Japanese strengths in close-quarters combat. Yi Sun-sin's solution was characteristically brilliant and audacious. Rather than accepting battle on unfavorable terms, he would lure the enemy fleet to Hansan Island, where the broad waters would allow him to employ the tactical formation that would become his masterpiece, the crane wing formation that would crush Japanese hopes of naval supremacy. The plan required perfect timing and absolute confidence in his subordinates' abilities. Korean ships would appear at Myeongnyang as if preparing to attack, then turn and flee when the Japanese fleet moved to intercept them. The enemy, confident of victory against apparently demoralized opponents, would pursue the Koreans into the open waters where Yi Sun-sin's trap awaited. The psychological aspect of this strategy was as important as its tactical elements. Japanese commanders had to believe they were facing a beaten enemy attempting to escape rather than a calculating opponent leading them into a carefully prepared ambush. This required Korean ships to maintain the appearance of desperate flight, while actually executing a complex withdrawal designed to position enemy forces exactly where Yi Sun-sin wanted them. As the two fleets approached their date with destiny at Hansan Island, the stage was set for one of the most significant naval battles in Asian history. The outcome would determine not just the fate of Korean resistance but the entire trajectory of East Asian politics for centuries to come. Victory would establish Yi Sun-sin as one of history's greatest naval commanders, while defeat would likely mean the end of Korean independence. The Japanese fleet that sailed toward Hansan Island carried with it the confidence of a nation that had never known defeat in foreign conquest, and the professional skill of commanders who had mastered their craft through constant warfare. Against them stood a Korean admiral whose career had been marked by disgrace as well as triumph, leading sailors who had never faced an enemy of this caliber in their entire careers. The collision between these forces would produce more than victory or defeat. It would create legends that would inspire future generations and tactical innovations that would influence naval warfare for centuries. But in those final hours before battle, as both fleets maneuvered for advantage in waters that would soon run red with blood, only one thing was certain. The world was about to witness something extraordinary. The waters off Hansan Island had witnessed many storms, but none like the tempest of steel and fire that was about to unfold. As dawn broke over the Yellow Sea on that fateful day in 1592, two fleets approached their destiny with the inevitability of celestial bodies moving toward eclipse. What happened next would become the most studied naval battle in Asian history, and the foundation of Yi Sun-sin's immortal legend. The Japanese fleet commanded by Wakizaka Yasuharu was a magnificent sight, 73 warships arranged in battle formation, their red banners streaming in the morning breeze, their crews confident in the superiority that had carried them to victory after victory in their homeland's civil wars. These were not merchant sailors pressed into military service, but professional warriors who had learned their deadly trade through constant combat. Yi Sun-sin watched their approach from his position near Hansan Island, with the cold satisfaction of a master strategist whose carefully laid trap was about to be sprung. Every element was in place. The Korean decoy ships had successfully lured the enemy from the narrow confines of Myeongnyang Strait to these broad waters where maneuverability would determine victory. The Japanese commanders, convinced they were pursuing a beaten enemy, had placed themselves in exactly the position where Korean tactical superiority could be most devastatingly employed. The signal came at the precise moment when the Japanese fleet reached the optimal position for destruction. Korean ships that had appeared to be fleeing in disorder suddenly wheeled around with military precision, forming the crane-wing formation that would become Yi Sun-sin's tactical masterpiece. Like the wings of a great bird of prey spreading to envelop its victim, Korean vessels extended in a great arc that would surround and systematically destroy the enemy force. The transformation was breathtaking in its speed and coordination. Ships that had seemed to be scattered in panicked retreat revealed themselves to be elements of a perfectly choreographed battle plan. The turtle ships, those revolutionary engines of destruction, took their positions at the center of the formation where their armored hulls could absorb enemy fire while dealing out devastating punishment in return. Wakizakayasu Haru realized his error too late. The Korean fleet he had dismissed as inferior was demonstrating tactical sophistication that matched anything his experienced commanders had encountered. Worse, his ships were now trapped in the killing zone of a formation specifically designed to maximize Korean advantages while neutralizing Japanese strengths. What followed was not so much a battle as a systematic annihilation. Korean gunners, trained to precision through months of intensive drill, poured devastating fire into Japanese ships caught in an impossible tactical situation. The turtle ships proved virtually invulnerable to enemy counterattacks, while their cannon systematically shattered Japanese hulls and rigging. Traditional Korean warships, positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire, prevented any Japanese vessel from escaping the carefully planned destruction. The Japanese fleet that had entered Korean waters with such confidence found itself helpless against an enemy that fought with scientific precision, rather than mere courage. Ship after ship succumbed to the methodical Korean assault, until the waters around Hansan Island were littered with burning wreckage and the cries of defeated warriors. When the smoke finally cleared, the strategic balance of the entire war had been fundamentally altered. Of the 73 Japanese warships that had entered the battle, 59 had been destroyed or captured. Thousands of Japanese sailors and soldiers lay dead in the bloodied waters, while Korean casualties remained minimal. It was a victory so complete that even contemporary observers struggled to comprehend its magnitude. But Yi Sun-sin understood that military success must be immediately exploited before the enemy could recover and adapt. Within days of the Hansan Island triumph, his fleet was pursuing the scattered remnants of Japanese naval power toward their main base at Busan, the symbolic heart of the invasion that had brought such devastation to Korea. The advance on Busan represented the boldest stroke of Yi Sun-sin's career, a direct assault on the enemy's primary stronghold. Heavily fortified and defended by thousands of veteran troops, the risks were enormous, but so was the potential reward. A successful attack would demonstrate Korean naval supremacy so dramatically that it might force a complete Japanese withdrawal from the peninsula. The battle that erupted around Busan harbor was savage even by the standards of an age accustomed to brutality. Korean ships fought their way through multiple defensive lines, their guns systematically destroying Japanese vessels, while land-based artillery added to the chaos and destruction. The turtle ships once again proved their worth, advancing into positions where conventional warships would have been destroyed while dealing out punishment that shattered enemy morale. Victory came at a terrible price. Jinghyun, one of Yi Sun-sin's most trusted subordinates, fell in the assault, struck down while leading his men in the desperate fighting around the harbor. His death was mourned throughout the Korean fleet, but his sacrifice had not been in vain. Busan harbor was left littered with the wreckage of Japanese ambitions. and the invasion forces' supply lines were severed. The strategic consequences of these naval victories extended far beyond their immediate military impact. Japanese commanders, faced with the loss of naval supremacy, were forced to fundamentally alter their entire campaign strategy. Resources that should have been supporting the advance toward Seoul were instead diverted to defensive operations, aimed at protecting increasingly vulnerable supply lines. Recognition of Yi Sun-sin's achievements came from the highest levels of government. His appointment as Supreme Naval Commander of the three provinces represented not just personal advancement, but acknowledgement that naval warfare had become the decisive element in Korea's struggle for survival. The man who had once been disgraced for tactical prudence was now entrusted with coordinating the entire maritime defense of the kingdom. The year 1593 brought new challenges as the war entered a different phase. Chinese intervention had stalemated Japanese land operations, while Yi Sun-sin's naval campaigns had made seaborne supply increasingly hazardous. The result was a strategic deadlock that would eventually lead to negotiations, but for now meant that Korean naval forces must maintain constant pressure on an enemy that remained dangerous despite their setbacks. The period that followed would test Yi Sun-sin's character in ways that battlefield courage never could. As peace negotiations began between China and Japan, the intensity of active combat decreased, leading many to assume that the crisis had passed and normal routines could be resumed. This was exactly the kind of complacency that Yi Sun-sin knew could prove fatal. While others relaxed their vigilance, Yi Sun-sin maintained the same rigorous standards that had produced victory. Ships continued to be maintained in perfect condition, crews drilled relentlessly, and intelligence networks remained active. This dedication to preparation during apparently peaceful times was unpopular among subordinates who yearned for rest. But Yi Sun-sin understood that wars were often won or lost during the intervals between battles. The toll of maintaining constant readiness became apparent in his reports to the royal court. Documents that revealed the human cost of military excellence. Disease swept through naval bases, killing experienced sailors who could not be easily replaced. Food shortages left men weakened and demoralized. Equipment wore out faster than it could be repaired or replaced. Most critically, the psychological strain of indefinite military service was breaking down the social bonds that held military units together. His desperate plea to the government painted a stark picture of the challenges facing Korean naval forces. Military discipline has become lax and sharp fighting spirit has been broken. Epidemic diseases are spreading widely through the camps. Most of the soldiers in the encampments have fallen ill, and deaths continue daily. Moreover, they lack food and go hungry day after day, and when they fall sick after starving, they invariably die. The number of soldiers decreases daily, but there are no replacements. Just counting the naval forces under my command, there were originally over 6,200 men, but between last year and this year, including battle casualties and deaths from disease from the second and third months until now, we have lost 600 men. Those who died were all healthy men who could shoot arrows well and handle ships expertly. Those who remained can eat only 2 or 3 spoonfuls of rice morning and evening. And their hunger and wretchedness has reached an extreme where they cannot draw bows or row boats. This was the reality behind the glorious victories that had saved Korea from conquest. An exhausted, disease-ridden force held together by the iron will of a commander who refused to accept defeat regardless of the personnel cost. Yi Sun-sin's genius lay not just in tactical innovation, but in his ability to maintain fighting effectiveness under conditions that would have broken lesser men. The negotiations between China and Japan eventually collapsed, as Yi Sun-sin had predicted they would. Hideyoshi's demands were simply too extreme for any negotiated settlement, while Chinese terms were unacceptable to Japanese pride. The result was a resumption of hostilities on an even larger scale, with both sides having used the intervening period to prepare for more intensive warfare. The Second Japanese Invasion began in early 1597, with ominous signs that this campaign would be different from its predecessor. Japanese intelligence networks had been active during the peace negotiations, gathering information about Korean defensive preparations and identifying potential weaknesses that could be exploited. Among their most significant discoveries was the growing political opposition to Yi Sun-sin within the Korean court itself. The trap that would destroy Yi Sun-sin's career was set by the Japanese spy known as Yoshira, working in collaboration with Kunishi Kinoga. Their plan was elegantly simple: provide false intelligence about Kato Kiyomesa's planned landing that would force Yi Sun-sin into an impossible choice between military prudence and political obedience. The intelligence claimed that Kato Kiyomasa would attempt a specific landing operation that could be intercepted if Korean naval forces acquiesced. The information came through channels that had previously proved reliable, making it difficult to dismiss entirely. Yet Yi Sun-sin's experienced eye detected inconsistencies that suggested deception, rather than genuine intelligence. The political pressure to act on this information was enormous. Court officials who had long resented Yi Sun-sin's independent streak saw this as an opportunity to demonstrate that his cautious approach was actually cowardice in disguise. Admiral Won-gyeon, ambitious for higher command, publicly declared that he would have acted decisively where Yi Sun-sin hesitated. Yi Sun-sin's refusal to launch what he considered a poorly planned operation based on questionable intelligence provided his enemies with exactly the ammunition they needed. Accusations of disobedience and cowardice flew through the court, while Won-gyeon's supporters argued that a more aggressive commander could have achieved decisive results. The royal summons that arrived at Yi Sun-sin's headquarters was couched in formal language, but its meaning was unmistakably clear: he was being relieved of command and ordered to Seoul for investigation. The man who had saved Korea from naval defeat was being arrested on charges that could easily result in execution. The journey to Seoul must have been one of the most bitter experiences of Yi Sun-sin's career. Behind him lay the naval forces he had built into the most effective fighting force in Korean history. Ahead waited interrogation, possible torture, and quite likely death at the hands of political enemies who valued personal advancement over national survival. The investigation that followed was a travesty of justice designed to produce predetermined conclusions. Yi Sun-sin faced accusations that he had failed in his duty, endangered the kingdom through excessive caution, and possibly engaged in treasonous communication with enemy forces. The evidence for these charges was non-existent. But in the politically charged atmosphere of wartime Seoul, evidence was less important than political convenience. Only the intervention of Jang-tak, a court official with the courage to speak truth to power, saved Yi Sun-sin from execution. Jang-tak's impassioned defense reminded the court that the man they were preparing to execute had delivered the only meaningful victories of the entire war. His eloquence, combined with the obvious injustice of the charges, secured a commutation from death to the humiliation of white-robed service for the second time in his career. Yi Sun-sin found himself stripped of rank and forced to serve as a common soldier. The assignment to serve under General Gwanil was intended as both punishment and humiliation. The supreme naval commander reduced to the status of an ordinary foot soldier in a land campaign. Yet even as Yi Sun-sin endured this disgrace, events were unfolding that would vindicate his cautious approach and demonstrate the catastrophic consequences of replacing competence with political favoritism. Won-gyeon, elevated to supreme naval commander largely because of his willingness to promise aggressive action, was about to lead Korean naval forces into the greatest disaster in their history. The Battle of Chilchon-ryong would prove to be everything that Yi Sun-sin's careful planning had been designed to prevent. Won-gyeon's forces, lacking proper preparation and facing an enemy that had learned from previous defeats, were systematically destroyed in an engagement that eliminated Korean naval power at a single stroke. Of the hundreds of ships that Yi Sun-sin had built into an invincible fleet, only 12 survived the catastrophe,
News of the disaster reached Seoul like a funeral bell tolling for Korean independence.
The naval forces that had been the kingdom's primary defense against invasion had been eliminated through political meddling and military incompetence. Japanese armies were again advancing freely, their supply lines secure and their confidence restored. In this moment of supreme crisis, the same officials who had engineered Yi Sun-sin's disgrace suddenly remembered his irreplaceable value. Desperate messages were sent to General Guan Yu's headquarters, ordering the immediate restoration of Yi Sun-sin to naval command and authorizing him to take whatever measures were necessary to rebuild Korean maritime defenses. Yi Sun-sin's response to the summons revealed both his patriotism and his realistic assessment of the situation facing Korea. Rather than expressing bitterness at his treatment or demanding guarantees of future support, he focused entirely on the military challenges ahead. His first priority was determining exactly what resources remained available for the seemingly impossible task of recreating an effective naval force from the wreckage of Chilcheon-ryong. The inventory was heartbreaking. 12 ships and 120 men were all that remained of the great fleet that had once dominated Korean waters. Equipment was scarce, morale was shattered, and the enemy was advancing with renewed confidence in their naval superiority. Any rational assessment would have concluded that effective resistance was impossible under such circumstances. It was then that Yi Sun-sin spoke the words that would echo through Korean history. "I still have 12 ships." When court officials suggested that he abandon naval operations and fight on land where larger forces remained available, his response was immediate and uncompromising. "If we give up control of the sea lanes now, the enemy will have unlimited access to our coastline. 12 ships may seem insignificant, but I would rather die fighting with these 12 ships than live to see our waters surrendered without a battle." The confidence in that statement was not mere bravado, but the product of deep understanding gained through years of naval warfare. Yi Sun-sin knew something that his political critics did not, that naval combat was not simply a matter of numbers but of geography, tactics, and the will to fight intelligently rather than heroically. With the right strategy and the proper terrain, even a small force could achieve victory against overwhelming odds. The location he chose for this seemingly impossible stand was Myeongnyang Strait, a narrow waterway where tidal currents and geographic constraints would neutralize Japanese numerical superiority while maximizing Korean advantages. It was a gamble that would either restore Korean naval power or end in the death of the kingdom's greatest admiral. As Yi Sun-sin prepared for what might be his final battle, leading just 12 ships against an enemy fleet of over 300 vessels, the stage was set for one of the most extraordinary displays of military genius in human history. The boy who had fallen from his horse during a military examination was about to attempt something that would be remembered as long as people studied the art of war. Close your eyes and let these whispered memories carry you to peaceful sleep.